intend to outline some things about my portfolio, of which this title is right in the zone, infrastructure and economic justice. Infrastructure is sometimes seen as a pointy head thing, something that somehow doesn't impact directly on people until there's a particular project. But the truth is that the reason why we need to have the right approach to infrastructure policy and framework is so that if you do that in the right way, one that acknowledges that the role of infrastructure is to build not just productivity but sustainability and livability in our cities, then you'll avoid some of the individual issues that we have with specific projects. If you get the planning right, you'll get good outcomes. And so I've always been very passionate about infrastructure. I spoke about it in my first speech. I did grow up around the corner here in Pyrmont Bridge Road in public housing. And I think that's an example opposite what was in the kids' hospital, the children's hospital. I think one of the things that it strikes me as passing strange is that everyone in this city of Sydney seems to be able to make money out of housing except for government. And the attitude which is private good, public bad is exemplified, I think, by the housing issue, where there's been such pressure on housing and public housing in particular, and we haven't kept up the maintenance. We haven't regarded increasing the supply of public housing as part of the solution to the housing affordability issue. We did have the period of when we were in government where under Tanya Plibersek, the local member here, 20,000 additional public housing units were created as a part of our economic stimulus plan, as part of the response to the global financial crisis. But state governments, particularly conservative state governments, have an attitude towards the public, which is that they don't like it. And that is consistent with their attitude towards public infrastructure, be it transport, energy, water, or indeed communications. Can I say that therefore that infrastructure and economic justice, I believe, are very much closely linked. There are two ways you can create economic growth in a country. The first is investment in capital, investment in infrastructure. The second, of course, is investment in people, in human capital, through education and training and skills to make sure that people are equipped to compete in the changing economy, which is a fact of life. Good economic infrastructure, I believe, creates inclusion and it creates fairness. It attempts to, and with the creation of Infrastructure Australia, we attempted to break the nexus that's there between the short-term nature of the political cycle, 3 or 4 years, with the long-term infrastructure investment cycle. If you're sitting around a budget committee meeting and someone says, I can come up with a program that will deliver $100 additional funds in every household, and you're saying, well, I can come up with something that won't make that difference this year or indeed this term, but it's a rail line project like the Redcliffe Rail project to the northern suburbs of Brisbane, first promised in 1895, but it took a federal Labor government working with a state Labor government and indeed Moreton Bay Council to deliver that project. But we funded it, we started it, but Malcolm Turnbull got to open it. Because that's the nature, because by definition that time lag. And that's why the Infrastructure Australia process that said you do your planning first, you get it right, and then the funding flows, so that you get good outcomes in terms of projects. And good outcomes are about promoting equity, and that's why the key to transport and infrastructure issues in our cities is public transport. We see a great example at the moment with the WestConnex project, a project that doesn't meet the objectives which were established by Infrastructure New South Wales. What's the origins of this project? Infrastructure New South Wales, with its chairman Nick Greiner, did a report and said the key issue was freight from Port Botany and how that could be dealt with. As a result, well, you can get your chance to ask a question rather than a yelling. The fact is that Labor didn't support it. It's a state coalition government project that doesn't meet the objectives that were set. It's a project that doesn't go to. Sorry.
Yeah, it's hopeless. Just keep working.
It doesn't go to either the port or to, indeed, the airport. It has interchanges at Rozelle here and at St Peters, but it will require further road tunnels because of the fact that it essentially is a road to nowhere. And indeed, Labor made that point at the time, that the original processes that were undertaken have been completely forgotten. And it's an extraordinary process that we're undertaking, whereby a tunnel that is already starting to be built, like it's underway, it's not going to be stopped, it's under construction, and they don't know, however, where it's going to come up, which is unbelievable. They don't even have the EIS for the third part of the project. And it's precisely what we didn't want, and what Federal Labor actually put in place when we were in government was a process of rigour whereby projects, be it the WestConnex project here, the East-West Link in Melbourne and the Freight Link project in Perth, three projects where money was taken off public transport projects like the Metro in Brisbane, like the Parramatta to Epping Rail Link, which is what we funded here in Sydney, and like public transport to the airport in Perth, and the Melbourne Metro project where they cut $3 billion from that and put it essentially onto toll roads because the driver wasn't the proper planning processes, and indeed they prepaid the money from the federal government to state governments as a result of their approach to these issues, and cut funding for every public transport project that wasn't already underway. If you have an approach which the current government does, which has established an infrastructure financing unit in the Department of Prime Minister and Cabinet, and it's examining specific infrastructure proposals on the basis of whether they can attract private equity, private funding. What that does is discriminate and distort the market in favour of toll roads, because the truth is that you can't get an immediate return on a public transport project. When you build a public transport line, the economic benefit is more to the national economy. It's not through the fare box. That changes the economics of it. The government, as the state, be it a small s state I'm referring to here, be it a state government or a federal government, has a responsibility to look at the economic impact to the GDP of the nation or the state economy in terms of impact. And public transport stacks up every time once you look at that, which is why Infrastructure Australia recommended projects like Redcliffe Rail Line, Noongar to Seaford in South Australia, the regional rail link into Melbourne, Geelong, Bendigo and Ballarat. All of these projects are open. The Perth City Link project in Perth. Indeed, while I was the Minister, we funded more dollars went into public transport in that 6 years than all previous governments combined. that is 6 years, beat the 107 years between Federation up to 2007. And that's because when you do proper economic analysis, public transport does stack up for making sure that it's delivered. It mightn't deliver dollars to a private operator, it does deliver to the national economy. And were we to be returned to government, we would return to that proper economic analysis to drive economic infrastructure, and if you do that, you get good outcomes. The NBN is, I think, also should be regarded as a social equity project. It's something that isn't just about downloading movies, however that might be important. It's about delivering education services, it's about delivering health services, and it's about delivering, it should be, on the basis of need. That's why we had a universal delivery model, so that fibre to every home, to every business, and to 93%, we live in a very big country, so some remote areas would get satellite, but 93% would get that direct fibre connection. Under this government, you have three different models: fibre to the home, fibre to the node, a sort of box on the corner, and then copper from there, or delivery through HFC cables, essentially through Foxtel, through that network as well. Optus and Foxtel. Optus, of course, were very much a part of establishing Foxtel as well. So you have a system whereby you have a digital divide, and the digital divide is pretty clear. On one side, where you have fibre to the home, that's the Labor model. On the other side, where you get an inferior system, that's the Malcolm Turnbull model. And it's one that that discriminates essentially on the basis of income. Because if you are on the wrong side of the street and you're getting copper and you can afford to have fibre delivered to your home, of course you can pay for it. And that is their model. We saw it as an enabler of opportunity, of the opportunity for those of you, and I have a son who is just started year 12 here at the local high school. Everything is done over the internet. We don't have broadband at home. We're still operating on ADSL2 where we live in Marrickville, and it cuts out all the time. Why should that be based on income? We regard high-speed broadband through fibre, doing it right, doing it once, and doing it with fibre, as being an essential infrastructure component in the 21st century. Because what will happen as night follows day, once this rollout is finished, what will occur is that you will have circumstances whereby they'll have to go and retrofit fibre to the home. And that always costs more. It's so much easier to do it right the first time. And that's why I think that's a critical equity component. Just as Labor's approach to energy and to water, similarly, was about to make sure that in terms of energy, when I became the environment spokesperson for Labor, the renewable energy target was 2%. 2. We changed it in the climate change paper in 2006 to 20 by 2020. And we have a commitment to 50% by 2030 and to zero emissions by 2050. That's consistent with the targets established by the Climate Change Authority. That's also an equity argument in terms of making sure that people can engage and have access to energy and water at a price that they can afford. The fact is that renewable energy is increasingly the most competitive option, but that's only because you've had those systems in place that have encouraged that mechanism. High-speed rail is another, I think, visionary project that would change the nature of our debate between cities and regions. One of the things that could happen with high-speed rail between Brisbane and Melbourne via Sydney and Canberra is that our regional communities could have, if they were, if Newcastle was under an hour from Sydney, Canberra the same, CBD to CBD, all of a sudden you're tackling housing affordability, you're tackling opportunity by people being able to live in regional communities but have access to a global city of Sydney, and you can do it in a way that delivers for the economy as well. The study that we commissioned shows $2.15 benefit for every dollar invested between Sydney and Melbourne. Similarly, Western Sydney Airport, and I say Western Sydney Airport, not Sydney's second airport. Western Sydney has 2.2 million people. What we need to do in a city like Sydney, in terms of urban policy, it doesn't work if you have a hub and spoke approach. A hub of the CBD of Sydney and the spoke going out. All transport links going to the CBD and high value jobs with the changing nature of the economy being in our CBD, but people who can't afford to live, you look at housing prices in this area have changed a little bit since I grew up. They can't afford to live here, so living in the outer suburbs, commuting vast distances, spending more time travelling to and from work than they do at home with their kids. You need drivers of jobs closer to where people live. You look at Westmead Hospital and the high value jobs that are created around Westmead. Westmead has more PhDs living within 5 kilometres of Westmead Hospital than everywhere except for the CBD. And that's because of those high value jobs. That's why we funded the Parramatta to Epping rail line, to open up those high value jobs in the Macquarie Park area to people in Western Sydney. It's why we say that the airport shouldn't be just a runway and a terminal. It needs to be an aerotropolis. It needs to be a catalyst for jobs and investment in the area. To take just one example, the science park that's being promoted by Celestino with $5 billion of investment. You have an extraordinary proposal there. It will be the first K-12, kindergarten to year 12, STEM, science, technology, engineering and maths school. You'll have some 12,000 jobs in the area, high value in the science area. That route where you can have some value capture for the rail line from north-south from St Mary's through Badgerys Creek to the Macarthur region to Campbelltown, we've identified as that will be our #1 priority in terms of investment for infrastructure for Sydney. That will open up those jobs that will be created as a result of the airport to people in Campbelltown, to people in St Mary's, to people right up to Rouse Hill. And we need to have, Sydney doesn't work at the moment in terms of transport because all the public transport routes are just to and from the CBD. And our wonderful geography that makes this a great city, the harbour and the rivers, mean that that is a difficult task compared with some other cities that are flatter, that don't have the natural features that Sydney has. And that is about making sure that we don't have a circumstance, and this is my second last point, is that the circumstances need to be created whereby when you say where you live, when you look at someone's postcode, you can't automatically judge what their income is. The truth is Sydney is in danger of doing that. This area is relatively wealthy compared with whole areas of Sydney. And we need to make sure that successful cities are inclusive cities. They're not cities of suburbs of advantage and suburbs of disadvantage. They require one of the great things about the agglomeration that brings people together, why people come together in cities, is the vibrancy of that collective interaction which occurs. And if that occurs on the basis of a divisive circumstance, then it also has implications for our politics in terms of the sort of issues that are in one area being set against another area as well. The danger that we have also with development is that in the past a lot of the problems have been created because our outer suburbs have been developed, and you see it now. Housing affordability, how do you solve it? We just open up more areas for development in the outer suburbs without thinking about what the social infrastructure is. Where do the kids go to school? Where do the kids go where do the families get their health care? How do they get to work? What transport infrastructure is there? I mean, in this area here, you can walk to light rail, you can walk to any range of bus routes. People in Western Sydney just don't have that. And Western Sydney is not Parramatta. It's a lot way further west than that. And particularly in terms of routes along the north-south route, the car is necessary in Western Sydney because there simply aren't options to get around. We need to acknowledge the mistakes that were made in terms of that releasing of suburbs without having the infrastructure in place, but also we're in danger of having a different mistake, but due to the same philosophy here, the philosophy of developers let rip and let anything go. And we're seeing that in the inner suburbs now. We're seeing it, perhaps the worst proposal I've seen is the Carrington Road proposal in Marrickville. An industrial site where they're planning literally thousands of units in an area that's a floodplain where there's one road in and one road out. Mirvac's development is an example of greed over common sense. And there was a public meeting at Marrickville Town Hall last Thursday night. I just attend meetings Thursday night, where about 600 people attended. It is a diabolical proposal, and it's an example of a Mirvac who did this development here at Harold Park. I'm not against all development, and particularly along public transport routes. If we're going to stop people moving where there's no social infrastructure at all, but it's got to be appropriate, it's got to be well designed, it's got to increase and enhance livability, not destroy it. And there are examples of good developments where that's occurred. The proposals that the developments around Arlington Park, for example, Arlington Oval and Dulwich Hill, for example, there's a whole range of higher and medium density development where, because families, the composition is changing, where people want to live. People want to live here, I must say, as well at Harold Park. But the inappropriate let it rip attitude of the state government along the Sydenham to Bankstown line is an atrocity and will lead to major social issues down the track. And I'll finish up with one example, which is today or yesterday. I think maybe yesterday they made the decision. It's been a bit of a blur in Canberra. It's been a bit busy in the last few days, you might have noticed. But the decision of the state government to knock back heritage listing for the Sirius building, which is an example of brutalist architecture. To me, one of the great things about when international visitors, I get to entertain them from time to time, and if you take them to the zoo or somewhere in the city, I'd always point towards that building that you could see a fair way away and say, that's public housing. That's what Australia's about. Giving harbour views shouldn't be just for the incredibly wealthy. That is purpose-built for people to age in place and for people with disabilities. And it's a direct result of the activity that occurred, mobilisation of inner city residents to the proposals to flog off the housing in the 1970s and let development just rip, and people like Bruce and Lynn Charles and others who are here were part of all of that struggle that generation did. But the idea that, which is the sort of market approach gone mad, which is if you can sell a house in Millers Point, and I accept you can sell a house there for $3 million and then build 5 houses somewhere else. I accept that that's probably the case. But the end result of that is that you will eventually have no public housing at all in Sydney. You will just keep moving people out. And the treatment of people with my first political campaign was as a very young man, before I joined the Labor Party, because I wasn't 15 yet, when the Tories got control of the City Council and tried to sell off our houses. They sold half the big flats at Glebe, but we had a rent strike, and we organised against that because the family that, as it turned out, the home where I grew up, when my mother was born and died, she lived her entire 65 years in that house. I think people should be treated with respect. And what occurred in Millers Point was that one gentleman who was more than 80 years old and had lived in the one house for more than 80 years got his eviction notice just put under his door. And that sort of approach towards taking people out of the economic equation is, I think Australia's better than that. And that's why we need to, in everything that we do with regard to infrastructure, whether it's housing or transport issues and how we deal with our cities, they need to be inclusive. I think it actually makes the city much better. And I think even the wealthier people who can now live in the CBD of Sydney, it's a better place to live because there's a mix there. That brings the dynamic that makes someone. I still I very much like living in Marrickville. I worry that every time a traditional resident in Marrickville sells their house, someone who's not a traditional resident and unlikely to be, it's losing some of its character, some of the things that attracts people there. As because of the Greek, in particular, heritage, but other heritages as well with the ethnic communities. The truth is, the ethnic communities are leaving because they can't afford to live there, and they're selling their houses. And people like me, but I've lived there forever, with tertiary education and professionals are moving in. We need to keep the character of our cities, and that requires a conscious government policy to make a difference. It doesn't just happen. The market has no conscience. It doesn't build people into the equation, and that's why we need to oppose free market policies. Thanks very much.